Jack and the Beanstalk. This is the story of how Jack did a silly thing, but all was well in the end. Jack and his mother were very poor, and there came a sad day when there was no more money left. So Jack was told to take the cow to the market to sell her. As Jack led the cow to the market, he met a funny little man with a tall feather in his hat. "And where might you be going with that fine-looking cow?" the funny little man asked. Jack explained that the little man swept off his hat and shook out 5 colored beans. "Well, I can save you a journey. I will give you these 5 magic beans in exchange for your cow." Once Jack heard the word magic, he didn't stop to think. He took the beans at once, gave the funny little man the cow, and ran off home to his mother. "Jack, you are a fool. You have exchanged a fine cow for 5 worthless beans." She flung the beans out the window and sent Jack to bed without any supper. When he woke in the morning, Jack couldn't understand why it was so dark in the cottage. He rushed outside to find his mother staring in amazement at an enormous beanstalk that reached right up into the clouds. "I told you they were magic beans," smiled Jack, and he began to climb the beanstalk. He climbed until he could no longer see the ground below. At the top, there stood a castle. Jack knocked on the door, and it was opened by a huge woman. "My husband eats boys for breakfast, so you had better run away," she told Jack. But before Jack could reply, the ground started to shake. "Too late," said the giant's wife. "You must hide." And she bundled Jack into a cupboard. Jack peeped through the keyhole and saw the most colossal man. "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman," he roared. "Don't be silly, dear. You can smell your breakfast," said the giant's wife, placing a plate filled high with fat, juicy sausages in front of him. The giant did not seem to have very good table manners, and it soon gobbled a lot. Then he poured a great bag of gold onto the table, and with a smile on his big face, he soon fell asleep. Jack darted out of the cupboard, grabbed the bag of money, ran out to the kitchen, and slithered down the beanstalk. Jack's mother bought 2 cows, and they were very content. But after a while, Jack decided he would like to climb the beanstalk again. The giant's wife was not pleased to see him. "My husband lost a bag of gold when you were here," she muttered, but the ground began to shake, so Jack hid in the cupboard. "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman." "Don't be silly, dear. You can smell your breakfast," said the giant's wife, placing a plate piled high with 38 chickens in front of him. The giant had soon gobbled the lot. Then he lifted the golden hen onto the table. With a smile on his big face, he fell asleep, snoring loudly. Jack darted out of the cupboard, grabbed the golden hen, ran out of the kitchen, and slithered down the beanstalk. Jack's mother bought a herd of cows, lots of new clothes, and they were very content. But after a while, Jack decided he would like to climb the beanstalk one last time. The giant's wife was not pleased to see him. "My husband lost the golden hen when you were here," she grumbled. But then the ground began to tremble. This time Jack hid under the table. The giant stomped into the kitchen. "Fee, fi, fo, fum! I smell the blood of an Englishman." "I would look in the cupboard," said the giant's wife, but it was empty. They were both puzzled. "Eat your breakfast. I have cooked you 92 fried eggs," said the giant's wife, placing a plate in front of him. The giant had soon gobbled the lot. Then he lifted the golden hob onto the table and was soon fast asleep, snoring loudly. Jack crept out and grabbed the golden hob. But then the hob called, "Master!" and the giant awoke. He chased Jack, who scrambled down the beanstalk as fast as he could with the hob in his arms. As soon as Jack reached the ground, he chopped through the beanstalk with an axe. Down tumbled the beanstalk and the giant. That was the end of them both, and Jack and his mother lived happily for the rest of the days. Rapunzel. Once upon a time there lived a man and his wife who for years and years had wanted a child. One day the wife was looking sadly out of the window. Winter was coming, but in the garden next door, which was surrounded by a huge great wall, she could just see rows and rows of delicious vegetables. In particular, she could see a huge bunch of Rapunzel, a special kind of lettuce. Her mouth watered. It looked so fresh and green. "Husband, I shall not rest of some of that Rapunzel growing next door," she whispered. The husband clambered over the wall and quickly picked a small bunch, which he took back to his wife. She made it into a salad and ate it all up, but the next day all she could think of was how delicious it had been, so she asked him to pick her some more. He clambered over the wall and was picking a small bunch of the Rapunzel when a voice behind him hissed, "So you are the one who has been stealing my Rapunzel." When he spun around, there stood a witch, and she looked very angry indeed. The husband was terrified, but he tried to explain that his wife had been desperate for some fresh leaves for her salad. "You may take all of the leaves required then, but you must give me your first child when she is born," smiled the witch, and it was not a nice smile. The husband was greatly relieved. However, for he knew that there was little chance of his wife ever having a daughter, so he fled back over the wall, clutching the bunch of Rapunzel. He did not tell his wife of his meeting with the witch, for he thought it would only frighten her, and he soon forgot all about his adventure. But it all came back to him when 9 months later, his wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. No sooner had she laid the baby in her cradle than the witch appeared to claim the child. The wife wept, the husband pleaded, but nothing could persuade the witch to forget the husband's awful promise, and so she took the tiny baby away. The witch called the baby Rapunzel. She grew into a beautiful girl with long, long hair as fine as spun gold. When she was 16,
The witch took Rapunzel and locked her in a tall tower so no one could see how beautiful she was. The witch threw away the key to the tower, and so whenever she wanted to visit Rapunzel, she would call out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel would then throw her golden plait of hair out of the window at the top of the tower so the witch could slowly scramble up. Now one day a handsome young prince was riding through the woods. He heard the witch call out to Rapunzel, and he watched her climb up the tower. After the witch had gone, the prince came to the bottom of the tower and he called, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," and he climbed quickly up the shining golden plate. You can imagine Rapunzel's astonishment when she saw the handsome prince standing in front of her, but she was soon laughing at his stories. When he left, he promised to come again the next day, and he did, and the next, and the next, and soon they had fallen in love with each other. One day, as the witch clambered up to Rapunzel, she exclaimed, "You are slow. The prince doesn't take nearly as long to climb up the tower." But no sooner were the words out of her mouth than she realized a terrible mistake. The witch seized the long golden plate and cut it off. She drove Rapunzel far away from the tower and then sat down to await the prince. When the witch heard him calling, she threw the golden plate out the window. Imagine the prince's dismay when he sprang into the room only to discover the horrible witch instead of his beautiful Rapunzel. When the witch told him he would never see his Rapunzel again, in his grief, he flung himself out of the tower. He fell into some brambles which scratched his eyes so he could no longer see. And thus he wandered the land, always asking if someone had seen his Rapunzel. After 7 long years, he came to the place where she had hidden herself away. As he stumbled down the road, Rapunzel recognized him, and with a great cry of joy, she ran up to him and took him gently by the hand to a little cottage in the woods. As she washed his face, 2 of her tears fell on the prince's eyes and his sight came back. And so they went back to his palace and lived happily ever after. The witch, you will be pleased to hear, had not been able to get down from the tower, so she did not live happily ever after.
The Gingerbread Man. One fine sunny day, an old woman was making some ginger biscuits. She had a little dough left over, and so she made the gingerbread man for husband. She gave him raisins for eyes and cherries for husband, and put a smile on his face with a piece of orange peel. Then she plopped the biscuits and gingerbread man in the oven. A little while later, she lifted the tray out of the oven when the biscuits were cooked. Suddenly, the gingerbread man hopped off the tray and ran straight out of the door. The old woman ran after him, and her husband ran after her, but they couldn't catch the gingerbread man. He called out, "Run, run, run, as fast as you can. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." The old dog in his kennel ran after the old man and the old woman, but he couldn't catch the gingerbread man. The ginger cat, who had been asleep in the sun, ran after the dog,
but she couldn't catch the gingerbread man. He called out, "Run, run, run as fast as you can. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." The brown cow in the meadow lumbered after the cat, but she couldn't catch the gingerbread man. The black horse in the stable galloped after the cow, but he couldn't catch the gingerbread man. He called out, "Run, run, run as fast as you can. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." The fat pink pig in the stye trotted after the horse, but she couldn't catch the gingerbread man. The rooster flapped and squawked after the pig, but he couldn't catch the gingerbread man. He called out, "Run, run, run as fast as you can. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." He ran and ran, and the old woman and the old man, the dog and the cat, the cow and the horse, the pig and the rooster all ran after him. He kept running until he came to the river. For the first time since he had hopped out of the oven, the gingerbread man had to stop running. "Help! Help! How can I cross the river?" he cried. A sly fox suddenly appeared by his side. "I could carry you across the river," said the sly fox. The gingerbread man jumped onto the fox's back, and the fox slid into the water. "My feet are getting wet," complained the gingerbread man. "Well, jump onto my head," smiled the fox, showing a lot of very sharp teeth. And they kept on swimming. "My feet are still getting wet," complained the gingerbread man after a while. "Well, jump onto my nose," smiled the fox, showing even more very sharp teeth. The gingerbread man jumped onto the fox's nose, and snap! The fox gobbled him all up. When the fox climbed out of the river on the other side, all that was left of the naughty gingerbread man was a few crumbs. So the old woman and the old man, the dog and the cat, the cow and the horse, the pig and the rooster all went home and shared the ginger biscuits. They were delicious. The Red Shoes. There was once a woman who was so poor that she couldn't afford to buy her daughter Karen any shoes. The woman often wept to see Karen's feet all rough and blistered. She would have been overjoyed to know that the shoemaker's wife felt so sorry for Karen that she was making her a pair of red shoes from some leftover leather. But the woman never found out. She died the very next day that the red shoes were finished, and Karen wore them for the first time as she walked behind her mother's coffin on her way to church. The shoemaker's wife couldn't sew very well, and the shoes had turned up to be rather clumsy and misshapen. But Karen thought that the soft red shoes were the most wonderful things in the world. But the old lady who kindly took Karen in said, "You can't possibly go walking around in those odd things. Whatever will people think?" She threw the red shoes onto the fire and bought Karen a pair of sensible, sturdy black shoes that Karen was wearing when the old lady took her to the palace to see the parade for the little princess's birthday. The king and the queen stood with the little princess on the balcony, waving and smiling. But Karen didn't look at the gracious expressions on the faces or the fine, rich robes. Karen couldn't take her eyes off the red shoes on the feet of the princess. They were made of satin, not leather, so they shone like rubies. Those really are the most wonderful things in all the world, thought Karen. From that moment, whenever Karen buckled on her sensible black shoes, she thought of the little princess's beautiful red ones. Whenever Karen took off her sensible black shoes, she thought of the princess's beautiful red ones. And she longed for those beautiful red shoes with all her heart. One day, the old lady who looked after Karen looked at her sensible black shoes and tutted. My, those are looking rather old and shabby, and they're small for you now. We can't have you going along to church in those tomorrow. The old lady handed her a purse full of money. Buy yourself some new ones, she smiled. Karen walked all the way to the shoe shop with a thumping heart. First, she tried on some sensible, sturdy black shoes, but none fit her. Then she tried on some smart, lace-up brown shoes, but they either slopped up and down or cramped her toes. Then Karen peered up the high shelf and saw a red pair exactly like the ones the little princess had worn. They fitted her perfectly. Karen held her breath as she handed over her money and stepped out of the shop. Her feet gleamed and twinkled in the sunlight. She could hardly believe it. Her dream had come true. Karen knew full well that the old lady wouldn't approve at all of her choice. But luckily for her, the old lady's eyesight wasn't what it was, and the color of the Karen's new shoes was just a dark blue. Karen kept quiet, saying nothing of the truth. Next day, Karen's heart nearly burst with excitement as she slipped on her shoes. She tripped gaily to church, and even though there were many finely dressed people about, she had eyes for no one and nothing except the red shoes. She hoped that everyone would see them. Even as Karen sat in her church pew, she couldn't take her eyes off her red shoes. Even when the priest was praying, she couldn't take her eyes off her red shoes. Even when the organist began to strike up a hymn of praise, she couldn't take her eyes off her red shoes. The statues of the angels and saints seemed to frown down sternly upon her, but Karen didn't notice. She still couldn't take her eyes off the red shoes. As the choir started to sing and their voices filled the air, Karen felt a strange sensation in her feet. Her toes began to twitch inside the red satin. Her heels began to quiver. Suddenly, Karen's feet began to dance. Right there and then in church, her red shoes forced her to stand up and leap and turn and skip. With the eyes of everyone upon her, the red shoes danced down the aisle and out into the sunlight. "Help me!" she cried, but no one knew what to do. The red shoes danced Karen all around the graveyard and out of the church gate. Then they danced around and round the churchyard wall and off down the street. By day and by night, the enchanted red shoes carried Karen along, twinkling wickedly. They danced her in and out of houses and up and down stairs. They danced her through the city gates, across the fields and into the dark forest. They danced her out of the trees and through meadows, until Karen had forgotten how long she had been dancing. And still they made dance. "Forgive me," the sobbing girl cried out. Forgive me for thinking of these foolish things about everything else. At last, the red shoes was still. Utterly exhausted, Karen collapsed into a heap and closed her eyes. And when her soul reached heaven, she never had to dance or think about red shoes ever again.
Pandora's Box. When the world was first created, it was a happy place of light and laughter. There were no such thing as sadness or pain. The sun shone every day and the gods came down from heaven to walk and talk with the humans. One afternoon, a man called Epimetheus and his wife Pandora were outside tending the flower garden when they saw the god Mercury approaching. He was bowed down by a dark wooden chest that he was carrying on his shoulders. Pandora rushed to get the god a drink, while Epimetheus helped him lower the chest to the ground. It was tied shut with golden cords and was carved with strange markings. "My friends, would you do me a great favor?" sighed Mercury. "It is so hot and the box is so heavy. May I leave it here for a while?" "Of course you can," smiled Epimetheus. The man and the god heaved the chest indoors. "Are you sure that no one will find it?" asked Mercury anxiously. "No one under any circumstances must open the box." "Don't worry," laughed Epimetheus and Pandora, and they waved goodbye to the god. All of a sudden, Pandora stopped still and frowned. "Listen, Epimetheus," she hissed. "I am sure I heard someone whispering our names." Epimetheus and Pandora listened hard. At first, they heard nothing but the twittering of the birds. Then they heard the distant sound of a name being called from outside. "It's our friends," cried Epimetheus happily, but Pandora looked puzzled and shook her head. "No, Epimetheus, those aren't the voices I heard," she said firmly. "They must have been," Epimetheus laughed. "Come on now, let's go and see everyone." "I'd rather stay here for a while," Pandora insisted. As soon as Epimetheus was gone, Pandora hurried over to the strange box and waited. After only a few seconds, she heard it again. Distant voices calling, "Pandora." The voice was so low and whispery that Pandora wasn't sure whether she was really hearing them or was just imagining it. She bent down closer and put her ear to the lid. No, she was sure. The box was calling to her. "Let us out, Pandora. We are trapped in here in the darkness. Please help us to escape." Pandora jumped back with a start. Mercury had expressly forbade anyone to open the box, and yet the voices sounded so sad and pitiful. "Pandora," they came again. "Help us." Pandora could stand it no longer. Hurriedly, she knelt down and worked it at the tight golden knot. All the time, the whispering and pleading voices filled her ears. At last, the knots were undone and the gleaming cords fell away. She took a deep breath and opened the lid. At once, Pandora realized she had done a terrible thing.
The box had been crammed with all the evils in the world. Thousands of tiny moth-like creatures that stung people with their wings and caused hurt and misery wherever they went. Now, thanks to Pandora, the evils were free. They flew up and out of the chest in a great swarm and fluttered all over Pandora's skin. For the very first time, Pandora felt pain and regret. She began to wail with despair, and all too late, she slammed the lid back down to the box. Outside, Epimetheus heard his wife's cries and came running as fast as he could. The creatures fluttered to sting and bite him before speeding off through the window and into the world beyond. For the first time ever, Epimetheus began to shout at his wife in anger. Pandora yelled back, and the couple realized in horror that they were arguing. "Let me out!" interrupted a high voice. Pandora and Epimetheus grabbed onto each other in a panic. The voice was coming from inside the box. "Don't be afraid of me. Let me out and I can help you," came the voice. "What do you think?" Pandora whispered to Epimetheus, wide-eyed. "Surely you can't do any more mischief than you already have done," he grumbled. So Pandora shut her eyes and opened Mercury's chest for a second time. Out of the deep, dark box fluttered a single shining white spirit like a butterfly. It was Hope. Pandora and Epimetheus sobbed with relief as she fluttered against their skin and soothed their stinging wounds. Then she was gone, darting out of the window and into the world after the evils. And luckily, Hope has stayed with us ever since. Amel and the Genie. Many moons ago in ancient Persia, there lived a bright young man named Amel. He was out one day when he had the misfortune to meet a genie. Now, sometimes genies can be good news, but this one was in a very bad temper and he was looking for trouble. Amel had to think quickly. He had no weapons with him, only an egg and a lump of salt in his pocket. The genie came whirling up to Amel, but before he could say anything, Amel yelled at him. "Genie, you and I should have a competition to see who is the strongest." You might think this was very foolish of Amel, but he knew two things about Genie. One was that it's always better to take control first, and the second was that genies were not terribly bright. They are fine at conjuring up gorgeous palaces and flying carpets, but they are a bit slow when it comes to basic common sense. Well, the genie looked at Amel, and then he laughed. It was not a nice sound, but Amel was not daunted. "Ha! You don't look very strong," snickered the genie. "I shall win this contest easily." And then he laughed again. Amel picked up a stone. "You must squeeze the stone until water comes out of it," he said, handing the genie the stone. Well, the genie squeezed and huffed and puffed, but of course no water came out of the stone. He threw it down in a temper. "Not possible," he snapped. Amel bent down and picked up the stone and squeezed.
and with a crunching sound, liquid ran down Amel's fingers. The genie was astonished, and so would you have been if he had been there. What clever Amel had done was to put the egg in the same hand as the stone, and it was the egg that was broken. Genies are not terribly bright, and this one was no exception. Then Amel said, "Well, I win that one, but now perhaps you could crumble this stone into powder." And he handed the genie another stone. Well, the genie squeezed and huffed and puffed. But, of course, the stone did not crumble at all, not even the tiniest bit. The genie threw it down in a temper. Amel picked it up and squeezed, and as he squeezed, powder fell from his fingers with a grinding sound. The genie was astonished, and so would you have been if you had been there. But you can guess what clever Amel had done. He put the swords in his hand as well as the stone. The genie was feeling that his reputation was somewhat dented by Amel's performance, so he needed to get his own back. "You are clearly a great and mighty fighter," the genie said to Amel. "I shall like to give you a meal to celebrate your achievements. Come and stay the night with me." And he smiled. But Amel saw the smile and kept his wits about him. After a dreadful meal, they both laid down to sleep in the genie's cave. Once Amel was sure the genie was asleep, he moved to the other side of the cave, leaving his pillow in the bed to look as if he was still there asleep. Then he watched as the first light of dawn filtered into the cave. The genie woke up. He picked up a club, crept over to where he thought Amel was lying, and pounded the club down onto the bed. Then he stomped out of the cave to fetch some water for his morning tea. You can imagine his dismay when, on returning, he found Amel singing to himself as he lit the fire. "Morning, genie. I thought I would get breakfast ready," said Amel cheerfully. "I hope you slept better than I did," he continued. "Some wretched insect battered me in the face during the night." Well, at this, the genie gave a great shriek and whistled himself as fast as possible into an old oil lamp that lay on the floor of the cave. He wasn't seen again for hundreds of years, until a young lad called Aladdin happened to find the lamp. The Ugly Duckling. The mother duck was waiting for her eggs to hatch. Slowly the first shell cracked. A tiny bill and a little yellow wing appeared. Then with a rush, a bedraggled yellow duckling fell out. He stretched his wings and began to clean his feathers. Soon he stood beside his mother, watching as his sisters and brothers all pushed their way out of their shells. Only one shell was left. It was the largest, and the mother duck wondered why it was taking longer than the others. She wanted to take the babies down to the river for the first swimming lesson. There was a loud crack, and there lay the biggest, ugliest duckling she had ever seen. He wasn't even yellow. His feathers were brown and gray. Oh dear, said the mother duck. She led the family down to the river, the ugly duckling trailing along behind the others. They all splashed into the water and were soon swimming gracefully, all except the ugly duckling, who looked large and ungainly even on the water. Oh dear, said the mother duck. The whole family set off for the farmyard, where they were greeted with hoots and moos and barks and snorts from all the other animals. "Whatever is that?" said the rooster, pointing rudely at the ugly duckling. All the other ducklings huddled around the mother and tried to pretend the ugly duckling was not with them. "Oh dear," said the mother duck. The ugly duckling felt very sad and lonely. No one seemed to like him, so he ran away from the farmyard and hid in some dark reeds by the river. Some hunters came by with their loud, noisy guns and big, fierce dogs. The ugly duckling paddled deeper into the reeds, trembling with fear. Only later in the day, as it was growing dark, did he stir from his hiding place. All summer he wandered over fields and down rivers. Everywhere he went, people laughed and jeered at him, and other ducks just hissed at him or tried to bite his tail. As well as being ugly, the duckling was very lonely and unhappy. Soon, winter came and the rivers began to freeze over. One day, the duckling found himself trapped in the ice. He tucked his head under his wing and decided that his short life must have come to an end. He was still there early the next morning when a farmer came by on his way to feed the cows in the fields. The farmer broke the ice with his shoe, wrapped the ugly duckling in his jacket, and carried him home to his children. They put the frozen ugly duckling in a box by the fire, and as he thawed out, they fed him and stroked his feathers. And there the ugly duckling stayed through the winter, growing bigger all the time. Now, the farmer's wife had never had much time for the ugly duckling. He was always getting under her feet in the kitchen, and he was so clumsy that he kept knocking things over. He spilled the milk in the bucket from the cow. He put his great feet in the freshly churned butter. He was just a nuisance, and one day the farmer's wife had had enough. So, in a rage, she chased him out of the kitchen, out of the farmyard, and through the gates down the lane. It was a perfect spring day. The apple trees were covered in blossom, and the air was filled with the sound of birdsong. The ugly duckling wandered down to the river, and there he saw 3 magnificent white swans. They were so beautiful and graceful as they glided towards the bank where he stood. He waited for them to hiss at him and beat the water with their wings to frighten him away. But they didn't do any such thing. Instead, they called him to come and join them. At first, he thought it was a joke, but they asked him again. He bent down to get into the water, and there, looking back at him, was his own reflection. But where was the ugly duckling? all he could see was another great and magnificent swan. He was a swan, not an ugly duckling, but a swan. He lifted his long, elegant neck and called in sheer delight, "I am a swan! I am a swan!" And he sailed gracefully over the water to join his real family. The Little Match Girl. It was New Year's Eve and bitterly cold. Snow lined the streets like an untrodden white carpet, for all the people were indoors, preparing to bring in the new year. All alone in the windy square by the fountain, the poor girl who sold matches shivered. She pulled her ragged shawl closer around her thin dress. She rubbed her hands together and stomped her feet, but freezing snow came swamping through the holes in her boots. The little match girl hadn't sold one box of matches all day, and she was too frightened to go home, for her father would be very angry. Someone must pass this way and buy soon, she told herself. If only I could light one of my matches, that would warm me a little. Her fingers stiff with cold, the little match girl falteringly took out one of her matches and struck it. The match blazed into a bright flame, and the little girl cupped her hands over it, craving its warmth. As she stared into the center of the flame, she saw herself standing in front of a stove giving out heat that warmed her from the tip of her toes to the top of her head. Suddenly, the match's flame went out and the vision died with it. The little match girl somehow felt even colder than before. She didn't dare light another match for a long time. Then, just one more time, she whispered through her chattering teeth. Shaking, the little match girl drew out another one and struck it on the wall. The glimmer seemed to light up the stone until it was clear and glossy, like a crystal window. Through the window, she could see a room with a welcoming fire and a table laden with food. She held her hands to it. Then the match died. The magical room vanished, and huge tears filled the little match girl's eyes. Her numb hands fumbled to light another, and her face lit up with wonder in the glow of the third flame. A magnificent Christmas tree sparkled before her. It shimmered with glossy balls of many colors, and dots of candlelight danced all over its green needles. "How beautiful!" breathed the little match girl. Then the match scorched her fingers, and she dropped it into the snow. The Christmas tree was gone, but the glimmering light from its candles was still there, rising up into the night sky until they mingled with the twinkling stars. Suddenly, one of the lights fell through the darkness, leaving a blazing trail of silver behind it. "That means someone is dying," the little match girl murmured, remembering what her granny used to say when they saw shooting stars. As the little match girl stood dreaming of her grandmother, she lit up another match, and there was a granny before her and lighted the flame. As she lit one match after another, so the vision wouldn't fade like all the others, "Let me stay with you," she begged. And the old lady smiled and held out her arms for the little girl to run into, just as she had always done. At midnight, the church bells rang to welcome the new year. People danced, sang, and wished each other well. Lying in the snow by the fountain was a little girl's thin, lifeless body, surrounded by spent matches, where the little match girl had left them there when she had gone away with her grandmother. She had no need for matchsticks in the place where they were going. A place without cold, no hunger, no pain, just happiness. Hansel and Gretel. At the edge of the forest lived a poor woodcutter and his wife, a spiteful woman, and their 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. They were very poor, so there was often very little food on the table. One day, there was no food at all. Everyone went to bed hungry. That night, Hansel heard his mother tell his father, "Husband, there are too many mouths to feed. You must leave the children in the forest tomorrow." "Wife, I cannot abandon our children. There are wolves in the forest," said the poor woodcutter. But his wife made him agree to her evil plan. Hansel felt his heart grow icy cold, but he was a clever boy, and so he slipped out of the house and filled his pockets with shiny white stones. The next morning, they all rose early, and the children followed their father deep into the forest. He lit them a fire and told them he was going to gather wood and would be back to collect them. He left them, tears falling down his face. The day passed slowly. Hansel kept the fire going, but when night fell, it grew very cold and they could hear all kinds of rustling under the shadowy trees. Gretel could not understand why the father had not come back to collect them. So Hansel had to tell her that the mother had told the woodcutter to leave them there deliberately. "But don't worry, Gretel," he said. "I will lead us home." And in the moonlight, he showed her the line of shiny white stones that he dropped from his pocket, one by one, as the father had led them into the forest. They were soon home, and the father greeted them with great joy, but the mother was not pleased. Some time passed. They managed to survive with very little to eat, but another day came when Hansel heard his mother demanding that the woodcutter leave them in the forest again. And when Hansel went to collect some more pebbles, he found the door locked and he couldn't get out. In the morning, the father gave them each a piece of bread and led them even deeper into the forest than before. All day long, Hansel comforted Gretel and told her that this time he had left a trail of breadcrumbs to lead them safely back home. But when the moon rose and the children set off, there was not a breadcrumb to be seen. The birds had eaten every last one. There was nothing to do but go to sleep and wait until the morning. The next day they walked and walked, but they saw nothing but trees. And the next day was the same. By this time they were not only cold and hungry, but deeply frightened. It looked as if they would never ever be able to find a way out of the forest. But just as it was getting dark, they came to a clearing, and there stood a strange house. The walls were made of gingerbread, the windows of fine spun sugar, and the tiles on the roof of brightly striped sweets. Hansel and Gretel could not believe their luck, and were soon breaking off bits of the house to eat. Then a little voice came from inside. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who is that eating my sweet house?" Out of the front door came a very old woman. She smiled sweetly at the children and said, "Dear ones, you don't need to eat my house. Come inside and I will give you lots to eat, and you shall sleep in warm beds." Hansel and Gretel needed no second asking. They were soon tucked up, warm and full of hot milk, ginger biscuits, and apples. They both fell asleep quickly. Little did they know they were in worse danger than ever before. The old woman was a wicked witch, and she had decided to make Gretel work in the kitchen, and worst of all, she planned to fatten Hansel up so she might eat him. The very next morning she locked poor Hansel in a cage and gave Gretel a broom and told her to clean the house from top to toe. In the evening, the witch fed Hansel a huge plate of chicken, but she only gave Gretel a dry hunk of bread. But once she was asleep, Hansel shared his meal with Gretel. So they lived for many days. The witch could not see very well, so every morning she made Hansel put his fingers through the cage so she could tell how fat he was getting. But clever Hansel poked the chicken bone through the bars, so the witch thought he was still too skinny to eat. After many days, she grew fed up and decided to eat him anyway. She asked Gretel to help her prepare the big oven. The witch made some bread to go with her supper, and when the oven was hot, she put it in to cook. When the bread was ready, the witch asked Gretel to lift it out to cool. But Gretel was clever too. She pretended she couldn't reach the tray, and when the witch bent down, Gretel gave her a great shove and closed the door. And that was the end of the witch. Gretel released Hansel, and together they set off once more to try to find their way home. After all the adventures, fortune finally smiled on them, and they soon found the path home. The father was simply overjoyed to see them again. And what, you might ask, of the mean mother? Well, the poor woodcutter had not had a happy moment since he left the children in the forest. He had become so miserable that she decided there was no living with him. The day before Hansel and Gretel returned, she had upped sticks and left. That served her right, didn't it?
Cinderella. Once upon a time, when there were still fairy godmothers, there was a girl called Cinderella. She lived with her father and the two stepsisters. The stepmother did not like Cinderella very much, mostly because she was so much nicer than her two daughters. Cinderella was also much prettier. Oh, but the stepsisters were ugly. Cinderella had to do all the work in the house as the ugly sisters were also very lazy. They spent all the father's money on new clothes and endless pairs of shoes, and then went off to parties, leaving poor Cinderella with piles of stockings to mend. One day, a very grand invitation arrived. The prince was looking for a wife, and had decided to give a ball in 3 days' time for all the young ladies in the land. The ugly sisters could talk about nothing else. They bought lots of new dresses and many pairs of matching shoes, and then spent every hour trying them all on. They made Cinderella curl their hair and iron their ribbons and powder their noses. Cinderella was so exhausted running around after them that she had no time to look into her wardrobe to choose what she would wear. In wafts of perfume, the ugly sisters swept out of the door into the carriage without as much as a thank you to Cinderella. She closed the door sadly and went to sit by the fire in the kitchen. "I wish I could have gone to the ball too," she sighed. There was a sudden swirl of stars, and there, in front of Cinderella, stood an old lady with a twinkle in her eye and a wand in her hand. "You shall go to the ball, my dear Cinderella. I am your fairy godmother," she said, smiling. "Now we must be quick. There is much to do. Please bring me a large pumpkin from the vegetable patch. Oh, and 6 mice from the barn, and you will find 4 lizards by the water butt." Cinderella did as she was bid. With a wave of the wand, the pumpkin was turned into a glittering golden coach, and the mice into 6 pure white horses. The lizard became elegant footmen, dressed in green velvet. "Now you, my dear," said the fairy godmother, turning to Cinderella. A wave of the wand, and Cinderella's old apron disappeared, and there she stood in a white dress, glittering with golden stars. Her hair was piled on top of her head, and it too was sprinkled with stars. On her feet were tiny glass slippers with diamonds in the heels. "Enjoy yourself, my dear," said the fairy godmother. "But you must leave before midnight, for then my magic ends and you will be back in your old apron with some mice and lizards on your feet." When Cinderella arrived at the ball, everyone turned to look and stare at this unknown beauty who had arrived so unexpectedly. The prince hurried over to ask her to dance,
and then would not dance with anyone else all evening. The ugly sisters were beside themselves with rage, which of course made them look even uglier. Cinderella was enjoying herself so much that she forgot the fairy godmother's warning. So she had a terrible fright when the clock began to strike midnight. She turned from the prince with a cry and ran down the stairs of the palace into a carriage and disappeared as suddenly as she had arrived. One of the tiny glass slippers with diamonds sparkling on the heels had slipped from her foot as she ran. The prince picked it up and turning to the crowded ballroom declared, "I shall marry the girl whose foot fits the slipper." Cinderella, meanwhile, had just managed to reach the garden gates when all her finery disappeared, and by the time the ugly sisters arrived home, both in a towering rage, she was sitting quietly by the fire. The next morning, the prince went from house to house looking for the mystery girl whose foot would fit the glass slipper. But no one had feet that small. He reached Cinderella's house where first one ugly sister and then the next tried to squash her big feet into the slipper. "Please let me try," said a quiet voice from the corner, and Cinderella stepped forward. The sisters just laughed in scorn, but they soon stopped when they saw that the tiny slipper fit Cinderella perfectly. There was a sudden swirl of stars, and there, in front of Cinderella, stood her fairy godmother with a twinkle in her eye and a wand in her hand. In an instant, Cinderella was clothed in a gorgeous dress of cornflower blue silk decorated with pearls. On her feet, she wore white boots with blue tassels. The prince whisked Cinderella off to the palace to meet the king and queen, and the wedding took place the very next day. Cinderella forgave the ugly sisters. She was that sort of girl. But the prince insisted the sisters spent one day a week working in the palace kitchens just to remind them how horrid they had been to Cinderella.